Hey everybody, and welcome back to this series about building SwiftUI components. In the last episode, we learned a few techniques for improving the structure of our SwiftUI code. And today, we're going to take it one step further and look into building a reusable text input field with a floating label. Before we jump into the code, let's first talk a bit about something that is a key aspect of SwiftUI. It's interesting to note that while Swift is an object-oriented language, SwiftUI only makes limited use of the concept of inheritance. Instead, it favors composition over inheritance. And if you've built any UI with SwiftUI, you've already used composition to build your UI. It's a bit like building Lego. For example, this bus is built from a number of tiny bricks that together form this brilliant model. However, I can use the very same bricks to build something entirely different. In fact, many Lego kits contain instructions for building 2 or even more different models from the same set of bricks. And thanks to their genius mechanism to connect 2 or more bricks together by clicking them together, you can build almost anything. When we take a closer look, we can see that even the individual parts of this bus form components. For example, I can take off this upper deck to divide it into the upper deck and the lower deck. And inside I've got all those tiny little seats, and I can take this seat, for example, and insert it into this lower deck, like so. To explain how this principle works in SwiftUI, I'm going to show you how to build a simple text input field with a floating label. Instead of using inheritance, we're going to use composition to build this component by putting it together from several smaller foundational SwiftUI components. And along the way, we're also going to use some of the things we learned in the previous episodes. To get us started, I've created a very simple form with a couple of text input fields. Let's take a look. Now, it is interesting to note that the text field view expects a placeholder text. This text will be shown whenever the input field is empty, as is the case now. Once we start typing, the placeholder text will disappear. So now it's a bit difficult for the users to see what they're supposed to enter in which field, especially if they entered the wrong information or if the contents of the field don't provide enough context to understand what goes where. Wouldn't it be much nicer to see the placeholder text all of the time, for example, above the text input field? Let's try to build a simple version for one of our input fields. Thanks to SwiftUI's preview canvas, it's super easy to prototype UIs in place and see how they look straight away. I'm first going to wrap this text field in a VStack by command-clicking on the text field and then choosing Embed in VStack in the context menu. Next, let me add a text view to display the placeholder text. One way to do so is to click on the plus button in the toolbar. This will bring up the component library where I can now search for text. I can then drag the text element from the library and drop it into the editor area. Notice how the code editor makes space to make it easier for me to insert the view at exactly the right position. Now let's make sure this looks nice by adjusting the alignment of the elements in the VStack. The easiest way to do this is to Control-Option-click on the VStack to bring up the SwiftUI inspector, and then choosing Leading Alignment, like so. I also think we should make the placeholder label a little bit smaller. Let's use caption font for this. So Control-Option-click on the text view and then choose the caption font styling in the SwiftUI inspector. And finally, let me change the foreground color of the text to use the accent color of our application. And this time, I'll use the code editor to make the change. So far, so good. However, the placeholder text is now visible all of the time. Instead, I only want it to be visible when the user has entered text into the text field. One way to achieve this is to make the text view conditional. Command-click on the text view and then select Make Conditional from the context menu. We only want to show this view in case the first name attribute is non-empty, so the correct condition is if not shipping address dot first name dot is empty. When the first name attribute is empty, we want to hide this view so we can remove the entire else branch of the conditional statement. Let's see how this looks like. Now, if I enter my name, the placeholder label appears. However, it's not really smooth, so let's add an animation to fix this. We can specify an animation that SwiftUI should use for any element of this VStack by using the .animationView modifier and choosing the default animation. The live preview is still active, so we can go ahead and take a look at the result. Not too bad, but I think it would look much better if the placeholder text moved smoothly from inside the text field to the position above it. To achieve this behavior, we're going to make use of SwiftUI's ZStack. This allows us to place elements on top of each other, similar to a stack of transparent slides. So let's first wrap the text field in a ZStack. This time, I'm going to use the code editor. Next, let me add a text view for the placeholder text. Let's make sure the placeholder text is left aligned. Unfortunately, we cannot use the SwiftUI inspector to do this, so we'll have to do this manually. Nice! Did you notice? The text view exactly matches the placeholder text of the text field view underneath it. Let's update the foreground color to .placeholder text. And now we can set the placeholder text of the text field to an empty string. Now that we've got this in place, we can start to think about animating the placeholder label. There are three things we want to animate. We want to move the placeholder label slightly up as soon as the user enters some text. We also want to decrease its font size slightly. And finally, we want to tint the label using the accent color. Let's start by moving the label up. To move the label up, we can adjust its Y offset whenever the text we're editing is non-empty. So let's first specify the offset. And then add a ternary expression that results in 0 if the edited text is empty and -25 otherwise. Let's do the same for the scaling of the placeholder label. We'll want it to be 100% of the size when no text is entered and 80% of the size as soon as the user enters some text. We can change the label size by using the scale effect view modifier. Now, if we type some text into this field, you will notice it doesn't align well. Let's fix this by providing an anchor. This looks a lot better now. Since SwiftUI uses the bounding box of the text view to determine the space our view takes up in the form, we'll have to provide some padding at the top of the view. And finally, let's change the color accordingly. We'll want to use the accent color whenever the text field contains some text. And as a finishing touch, we tell SwiftUI to animate any changes in this view by appending .animation.default to the ZStack. And this looks rather sweet now. So now we've implemented two different ways to display a placeholder text floating on top of a text field. In the next and final section, we're going to use a technique we learned about last time and extract this view into a subview to make it reusable. Let's first extract the ZStack into a subview. To do so, command-click on the ZStack and then select Extract Subview from the context menu. Let's name it Text Input Field. Now, down here there are a bunch of compiler errors which are all related to the fact that we're trying to access the last name attribute on our model, which is not in scope inside our new view. We can fix this by introducing a new variable named text. And since this is a binding to the attribute we want to edit, we need to mark it as @binding. With this in place, we can now replace all occurrences of shippingaddress.lastname with text. At the call side, we need to pass in the attribute we want to edit, so let's add the last name attribute here. No, this looks pretty decent already, but we also need a way to specify the placeholder text. As you can see down here, we are still using a hard-coded value. Let's add a property named title to our new reusable view. And replace the hard-coded string with our title attribute. And at the call side, we now need to provide a value for this new parameter. If you recall what I said in the intro to this video, we wanted to make sure that our new SwiftUI component is a drop-in replacement for text field. However, if you compare the call signatures, you will notice they are different. Our new component requires the caller to provide a title label. To get rid of this, we need to introduce an initializer to our new view. To remove the requirement to specify the title label, we just need to add the underscore to the signature. And the binding needs to be passed as a binding of string, and then we're ready to assign those parameters to their respective properties. Note that we cannot assign the binding directly to the projected value of the text property. Instead, we need to assign it to its wrapped value. And with this in place, we can remove the title label in the call to our new component, which makes it a drop-in replacement for a text field. This means we can replace all other calls to text field with text input field. And here is a nifty little trick. Xcode supports multi-cursor editing. Just press Shift-Control and then click at all the locations you want to edit at the same time, like this. And now when I type input, this will be changed everywhere I placed a cursor. To leave multi-cursor edit, just press Escape. Let's resume the preview and then take a look how far we've come. Now, all the input fields can make use of this new behavior, and thanks to SwiftUI's power and flexibility, everything is nicely encapsulated and easy to use. Today, you learned that SwiftUI favors composition over inheritance. Instead of creating subclasses of existing UI elements and having to override their behavior, we can use several smaller UI components and assemble them into something bigger. You also learned how to handle data that is owned by another view. This is such an important aspect that we will spend more time on it in some of the upcoming episodes. We also spent some time on making our UI component a reusable drop-in replacement for a built-in SwiftUI view. This is really powerful as it makes it easier for people to adopt your component. Ideally, they will just have to search and replace the built-in component with your custom component. Following Apple's API designs is probably a good idea. After all, they spent a lot of time on their API designs, and what works for them should work for us too. So we've achieved quite a lot today, but we're not done yet. In the next episodes, we're going to look at distributing this component via the Swift Package Manager and CocoaPods, adding it to the Xcode component library, adding input validation, supporting secure input, making the component more customizable, and more. So stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.